Joining us right now to discuss this situation is Congressman Adam Kinzinger. He's on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Mr. Kinzinger is also a Iraq and Afghan war veteran. Thanks for being with us today, Congressman.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, those words coming from John Kerry, give us the latest on what you're hearing about any direct links or indirect links between Vladimir Putin, Russia, and the downing of this airliner.
Well, look, I think this is pretty obvious that, he had a lot to do with this, whether he directly supplied the missile or whether, it was just his support of these pro-Russian rebels who are putting, frankly, folks untrained and spotting military equipment in charge of a very complex weapon system. Regardless, he bears the responsibility. And you think back to when the Russians shut down the Korea airliner, of course, they didn't mean to shoot down the airliner itself, but they did, and they bear the responsibility. And you saw a very different reaction from President Reagan as you do today from the Obama administration. I mean, I actually kind of chuckled unintentionally when you read what Kerry said, because, at some point, and right when this airline was down, I thought maybe this would be a moment where the administration turns up the heat and really shows leadership. But I'm just not seeing it. I mean, it's just more and more the same, to where David Cameron of the Brits is actually showing the real leadership on the global stage that the president is. And he takes pride in a measured response, and all measured response means is, I'm not going to take any side. We're just going to continue to talk and talk.
Well, Congressman, we'll talk about some poll numbers, new poll numbers out today that indicate a lot of Americans don't want anything to do with putting more pressure on Russia in regards to Ukraine. But let's also focus a little bit more about the investigation into all of this right here. We're hearing reports of looting and stealing of evidence by Russian separatists, and how international investigators are being stopped from entering the crash scene. At this point, do you think the crash scene has already compromised the investigation to the point of no return?
Yeah, probably. I think it's obviously terrible. Could you imagine if you had a loved one, and imagining these separatists using it as a pawn and trying to just drag your loved one's body off? And I think, probably the integrity of the scene is trashed. But look, we know what happened. And I mean, in terms of the cause of this, I don't know if, having a completely intact crash scene is going to tell you if the Russians shot the missile or if the separatists shot the missile. We know what happened. It's the same with the flight data recorder in the black box. I mean, I'm a pilot, and I, understand what's going to be said. It's just going to be the airplane basically loses control immediately, and maybe you'll catch a few words of the pilot. But we know what it is. It's just now we've gotten to the point where it's terrible. I don't know what Vladimir Putin has to gain out of basically supporting the desecration of this scene, except for the fact that he doesn't care about international opinion. He only cares about his domestic opinion.
Or he wants to make sure that the blowback isn't too harsh on him, if there's anything that can be done about it at this point. There are some items of intelligence I want to ask you about. We had that video or the audio recording coming out late last week, and also there were reports of these missiles moving back and forth across the Russian-Ukrainian border here. But I know you mentioned the lack of leadership from the president's part, but as Congress looks at some sort of response or what to do, what types of specific evidence are you guys talking about as you ready some sort of plan or reaction?
Well, I think the kind of evidence we're looking for in terms of this specifically is exactly what you mentioned. What was the chain of custody on the missile that was launched? Did that come from the Russian military? Was it handed over to separatists? Was it a Russian military person that actually pressed the button, so to speak, in this SA-11, or was it somebody that trained a pro-Russian separatist? Were any of these separatists actually agents of the old KGB and the Russians? Were they intelligence agents? There's a lot of questions that we need, but in my mind, at the end of the day, our response should be the same, whether it was a legitimate pro-Russian separatist that was supported by the Russians, or whether it was the Russian military itself, which this is an international tragedy. And we ought to be bringing not just the United States on tougher sanctions, tougher penalties, restart our missile defense, put troops around Ukraine to support our NATO allies, but we ought to be dragging the Europeans with us. It's time that they, quit complaining, quit talking about just how bad their situation is, and start playing a role in the world again if they want to be if they want to have any kind of power. And it's time that the Europeans come along with us.
Well, Congressman, that's one area of agreement you share with Hillary Clinton, who mentioned the same thing. What can we expect from Europe now?
Well, I thought this was going to be kind of a moment of clarity for Europe, and it still might be. Very disappointed to see Angela Merkel say, oh, it's too soon to really do anything. Look, Europe is worried about their fragile economy. We all understand that. But Europe was worried about their fragile economy in the 1930s as well and ignored an emerging threat out of Germany. And so it's time, I think, for the Europeans to just say that they understand that standing against Vladimir Putin now is going to have big payoffs later. And we can do it in a way that's not going to harm their economy, but is also going to ensure that the Russians continue to have less of a grip over them. For instance, freezing their energy assets as a 20th century gas station instead of allowing them to get 21st century extraction methods like we use in the United States.
And is there anything being done specifically right now to address that last issue you just brought up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the latest sanctions regime. I don't know if it's going to be as effective as we need it to be. I think we need to go a little bit further in it. But again, ensuring that the Russians, they have their technology today, which is basically what we had in the 1950s. And now when it comes to fracking and other methods to explore the amount of energy that we have in this country, which made us the largest energy producer now, even over Saudi Arabia recently, that's the kind of stuff that we ensure that Russia can't get, and we export to places like Europe to ensure that they're offsetting Russia's energy stranglehold on the region.
I guess some of the strongest language we've heard in response has come from Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, who's calling for an expulsion of Putin from the G20 group, but since he's already been expelled from the G8, now G7, that really won't have much of an impact at all.
No, I do respect how tough Tony Abbott's been. I think we do need to make Putin an international pariah. I think anywhere we know that Putin has assets, he's sometimes estimated to be the richest guy in the world because of some of the things he's stolen from the state. Let's freeze those and take them. Let's make it very painful for Vladimir Putin. But let's understand that doing that is not necessarily going to be the thing where he raises his hands and says, oh my goodness, you got me. It's going to be the United States and Europe standing tough against his incursion into Ukraine and other places. We need to push back against his continued expansion of his border in Georgia, for instance. These are things that are going to make a difference. And understanding he has an 80% approval rating right now in Russia, we need to chip away at that when the Russians start to feel their life is not quite as good as it was before Putin or in the early days of Putin. That'll be the thing that really begins to undermine him.
Yeah, it's true. You mentioned his approval ratings there at home. The Russian media reports coming out of Moscow on this tragedy are simply surreal, placing most of the blame on the nation of Ukraine, and something people should check out if they want a lesson in state-run media. I also want to talk, Adam, since you mentioned the need perhaps for backing our allies like Poland. A recent poll in Politico shows that only 17% of Americans think we should get involved in a military way in Ukraine. What are your opinions on that? Only 17% of Americans think we should jump in here.
Yeah, you know, look, of course, every time in history and throughout American history, there's been very low public approval for doing anything militarily or getting involved really in foreign affairs. Or easy thing to do, and trust me, as an elected official, the easy thing to do is to stand in front of a group of people and say, just get out of the world, bring our boys home, and, you know, rebuild everything here. The problem is it takes very strong leadership to convince the American people when we need to get involved internationally. And that is something that this country is lacking. A president that can stand up and make the moral case for American leadership like President Bush did after 9/11 or like his father did for involvement in Desert Storm.
All right,
this is something this president can't do.
All right, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, we've got to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time, sir.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, we'll talk about that need for more American leadership on the global stage coming up later in the program. We're going to have a special interview with Mike Reagan, whose father, of course, had those strong words for the Soviet Union after the downing of the Korean airliner back in the 1980s. Also, we're going to keep you updated on the two major stories here, which we talked about in the Newsmax Now update, that being the Ukrainian situation there on the ground, not just with the plane, but the investigation and what follows. We talked about those Dutch here, which we talked about in the Newsmax Now update, that being the Ukrainian situation there on the ground, not just with the plane, but the investigation and what follows. We talked about those Dutch forensic experts, the Dutch forensic team. They're now on the ground there, and initial reports from those forensic inspectors to the Associated Press, they are saying that the smell of death is overwhelming. Remember, those bodies are supposed to be on a refrigerated in a respectful way. Also, new reports coming out of Gaza. Palestinian authorities are now saying that a hospital in Gaza has been bombed, 4 dead, 60 wounded. Again, those are the reports coming from the Palestinian side of things. Coming up here on America's Forum today, we're going to talk with Alan Dershowitz, of course, Harvard law professor and also expert on the Middle East. We'll get his take on these new reports coming in the ongoing situation in Gaza. Something seems different this time around here. I know we've had this happen 2 years ago, 2 years before that, and many years before that. But of course, the situation is very fluid. We'll keep you updated here on America's Forum throughout the day. I'm back with more. JD's on recovery mode, but we got much more here on America's Forum.